If you dance this waltz, I'll marry my son to you." The words sliced through the music and laughter like a blade. For a moment, the entire ballroom froze. 200 of Chicago's most powerful turned toward the sound of shattering crystal. A silver tray had slipped from trembling hands, and a rain of glass scattered across the marble floor, glittering like broken stars under the chandelier. At the center of it all stood Rick Halden Sr., real estate tycoon and self-proclaimed king of the city's skyline. His champagne glass raised high, his grin dripping with arrogance. He was pointing not at an honored guest, not at one of his wealthy peers, but at a black woman in a maid's apron, kneeling to gather the fragments of what she'd just dropped. "Come now," he sneered, loud enough for every whisper to die. "If you can't even hold a tray, maybe you can prove you're good for something else. Dance for us. Dance this waltz, and if you're better than my wife, I'll marry my son to you right here." The room erupted with cruel laughter. Silk gowns shimmered, diamond bracelets clinked against crystal glasses, and behind every polite chuckle was the same poison, amusement at someone else's humiliation. "Dad, stop," Ethan Halden muttered, shifting uncomfortably beside him. "This isn't right." But Rick didn't hear, or didn't care. His ego filled the space more completely than the orchestra's violins. On her knees, Amara Lewis, 35, a quiet contract cleaner who'd worked this job for only 3 weeks, gathered the shards one by one. Her hands trembled, but her eyes didn't. In their depths, there wasn't fear, there wasn't shame. There was silence, the kind that studies everything around it, the kind that waits. If you'd been there, you might have seen it too. That stillness, that calm before the storm. Because what no one in that room realized, what none of them could possibly have imagined, was that the woman they mocked had once made entire theaters rise to their feet, had once been a legend whose every movement commanded breathless awe. And tonight, before their disbelieving eyes, she would rise again. But we'll get there soon enough. Because what's about to unfold in that gilded hall beneath crystal lights, among sneering smiles, will prove that underestimating the wrong person can be the most expensive mistake you'll ever make. So don't blink. And if you're the kind of person who believes that grace, dignity, and truth can shatter arrogance into dust, then hit subscribe right now. You're about to witness a rebirth and the downfall of a man who thought he could own the world. The orchestra fell silent, bows frozen mid-air, as Rick Halden's voice thundered once again across the ballroom. "Play a waltz," he barked, snapping his fingers at the trembling DJ. "Let's see if our little guest can even move in time." His smirk widened as scattered laughter rippled through the glittering crowd. It was no longer a party, it was a spectacle, and Amara Lewis had become their evening's entertainment. From the edge of the dance floor, Miranda Halden, Rick's impeccably dressed wife, wrapped in a silver gown that shimmered like frost, raised one manicured hand and scoffed. "Darling, really?" she said, her voice dripping with venom. "You can't expect me to lower myself to compete with her." She gestured toward Amara with the effortless cruelty of someone who'd never had to fight for dignity in her life. Rick chuckled, swirling his champagne. "Oh, come now, Miranda. You've been taking lessons for years, haven't you? You even won that little charity trophy last spring. Consider this a warm-up." The crowd laughed louder, emboldened by his arrogance. Amara rose slowly, wiping her palms against her apron, her movements calm and deliberate, too deliberate for someone humiliated. She met Rick's gaze, her eyes steady, unflinching. "I accept," she said softly. Her voice was clear, unwavering, slicing through the laughter like the crack of a whip. A hush fell. Even the chandeliers seemed to stop trembling. The guests exchanged stunned looks. This wasn't how these things went. She was supposed to cry, to flee, to crumble under their mockery. But instead, she stood tall, poised, unshaken, as if the marble beneath her feet belonged to her. Rick blinked, taken aback for half a second before his grin returned, wider, crueler. "Excuse me? I said I accept your challenge," Amara repeated, her tone even, every syllable measured. "But when I win, and I will, you'll do more than keep your word about your son. You'll apologize, here and now, to every soul in this room for judging a woman by the color of her skin and the work she does." Gasps rolled through the ballroom like a slow wave. Some guests shifted uneasily, others smirked, waiting for Rick's explosion. Ethan, his son, turned pale. "Dad," he whispered urgently, "this is going too far." Rick ignored him. "An apology?" he echoed, pretending to consider. All right, sweetheart, but when you lose, and you will, you'll drop to your knees and beg for forgiveness for wasting our time. His laughter was sharp and hollow. Do we have a deal? Amara didn't flinch. Her eyes, dark, calm, endless, locked onto his. Deal. For a fleeting moment, no one moved. It was as if time itself was holding its breath. Then the whispers began soft at first, then growing louder. Does she really think she can dance? This is madness. Poor thing. She's digging her own grave. But not everyone laughed. A few faces in the crowd turned uncertain, disturbed. There was something in her stance, the quiet defiance, the fire beneath her composure that didn't fit the role of a woman defeated. Rick, meanwhile, was reveling in his spurred performance. He strutted through the room like a ringmaster in his private circus, his voice echoing off the marble walls. Let's make this interesting. 500 on Miranda to win. 1,000 for anyone foolish enough to bet on the Maid. Bills changed hands. Laughter swelled. It was no longer a party. It was blood sport. And yet, in the center of that storm of cruelty, Amara stood perfectly still. Her face was calm, her chin lifted slightly, her gaze fixed not on Rick, nor on the crowd, but somewhere beyond them, as if she could already see the ending no one else could. Ethan watched her, his stomach twisting. He didn't know why, but something about her, that stillness, that silent strength, unsettled him more than his father's mockery ever could. She wasn't angry, she wasn't broken, she was waiting. And though no one in that room understood it yet, the game Rick Halden thought he controlled had just changed. Because the woman he tried to turn into a joke had just rewritten the rules. 15 years earlier, long before she ever set foot in that marble ballroom, Amara LeClaire was a name that shimmered across the grand marquees of America's most prestigious stages. Back then, she wasn't a cleaning lady. She wasn't invisible. She was light itself, the kind that made audiences forget to breathe. On the opening night of her final tour with the American Grand Ballet Theatre, the velvet curtains had parted to reveal a vision, a woman whose every movement spoke in poetry. The orchestra swelled, the air trembled, and when Amara danced, time obeyed her. Every step, every turn, every rise of her hand drew gasps from the crowd, as if they were witnessing something divine. Critics had written that she didn't just perform, she transcended. When she took her final bow that night, the audience rose as one, thunderous applause echoing off the dome ceiling. It lasted for minutes, 5 long, unforgettable minutes that would mark the pinnacle of her career. But fame has a cruel way of turning applause into silence. That night, beneath the golden glow of the theater lights, Amara's world was flawless. Hours later, under a storm-scarred sky, it shattered. Her car slid across rain-slicked asphalt, metal screamed against concrete, and in one blinding instant, her body, her instrument, broke. When she woke days later, the rhythmic hum of monitors replaced the music she loved. Her legs were bound in casts. Her reflection in the hospital window no longer resembled the goddess who had once flown across a stage. The doctor's words were merciless. "You'll be lucky to walk again," he said gently, "but dance. Dance is out of the question." For weeks, she lay in silence, replaying the accident in her mind, the headlights, the crash, the helpless stillness. And worse than the pain was the emptiness, the knowledge that the one thing that had defined her, the one thing that gave her life meaning, had been stolen. The calls from friends stopped. The reporters moved on. The world, it seemed, had no room for a broken ballerina. She spiraled into solitude, the applause that once lifted her now echoing like ghosts in her head. There were nights she stood before a mirror, gripping the edge of a chair, forcing her body to remember what it had forgotten. A plie, a turn, a rise, and then pain searing, merciless pain, reminding her she was no longer who she had been. Months bled into years. The lights of the theater dimmed behind her, replaced by the harsh fluorescence of survival. When the bills piled up, she took whatever work came. The woman once adorned in silk tutus and satin shoes now wore uniforms stitched with someone else's name. Floors replaced stages, silence replaced applause. But even then, even as she scrubbed marble and emptied crystal glasses, there were moments brief, stolen when she closed her eyes and heard music again. In those quiet hours, alone and forgotten corridors, Amara would let her body sway ever so slightly, just enough to remember who she was. Her feet would trace invisible patterns across the floor. Her hands would rise like they once did before 1,000 eyes. It wasn't performance. It wasn't glory. It was survival, a heartbeat in motion. Because though the world had buried her name, the rhythm inside her never died. She had been broken, yes, but broken glass can still catch the light. And that night in Chicago, surrounded by cruelty and laughter, that buried rhythm began to stir, again a whisper in her soul, reminding her that legends don't vanish. They wait. Rick Howden's laughter rolled through the ballroom, sharp and triumphant. "Ethan," he barked, raising his champagne glass high, "get your phone out. You're going to want to remember this. The night a cleaning lady thought she could dance with the rich." His tone dripped with mockery, each word carefully chosen to draw another round of cruel chuckles from the crowd. The orchestra musicians shifted awkwardly in their seats, unsure if they should play or pretend they hadn't heard. The scent of expensive perfume mixed with tension in the air. Ethan hesitated. His hands stayed in his pockets. "Dad, please," he murmured under his breath. "You're turning this into something ugly." But Rick only sneered. "Ugly? No, son, this is entertainment. Now go on, record it. Posterity should witness what happens when people forget their place." A ripple of laughter followed his words, bouncing from one jeweled guest to another. Glasses clinked, bets were whispered. A woman in a red gown giggled behind her fan. 500 says she doesn't make it past the first 30 seconds, she said. 1,000, answered a man beside her, that she trips before the chorus. Across the floor, Miranda Halden stretched her arms dramatically, rolling her shoulders with exaggerated grace. "Let's get this over with," she said, forcing a brittle smile. "I'd hate to keep the help waiting." The crowd laughed again, eager to see her prove her superiority. Every movement she made screamed performance, the tilt of her chin, the sway of her hips, but her steps were rehearsed, hollow. She wasn't dancing for joy, she was dancing for validation. Meanwhile, Amara stood motionless. She hadn't spoken since accepting the challenge. The soft lighting caught the edge of her face, revealing an expression so calm it unnerved the audience. Her hands were relaxed at her sides. Her breathing was even. To the untrained eye, she seemed still. But anyone who had ever watched a true performer could sense it. She was centering herself, listening for something deeper than the music. Rick paced along the edge of the floor, grinning like a ringmaster watching his lion circle the cage. "Look at her," he jeered. "Can't even move. Maybe she's realizing this isn't the kitchen." Laughter erupted again, louder now, echoing against the crystal chandeliers. Ethan's stomach turned. He held the camera reluctantly, aiming it toward Amara, but his hands trembled. Something about her silence unsettled him. Not weakness, not fear, but the weight of composure. And then, from the far corner, a quiet voice broke through the noise. "Miss Lewis." Amara turned. A tall black man in a security uniform stood beside the column, pretending to adjust his earpiece. His face was older, lined with years of work and patience. "David Grant," he whispered, "head of security." His eyes narrowed as recognition flickered across his face. "I've seen you before, American Grand Ballet Theater. 15 years ago, you were—" He stopped himself, awed. "You were magnificent." For the first time that night, Amara smiled. It wasn't wide. It wasn't defiant. It was quiet, knowing the kind of smile that carried memories too deep for words. "I thought you were gone," David murmured. "After the accident, they said you'd never dance again." "People say a lot of things," Amara replied softly. Her tone was calm, but her eyes burned with resolve. She glanced back toward Rick, who was still parading his cruelty before the crowd, basking in their attention. Then she looked back at David. "Do me a favor," she said. "Keep your phone ready. Record everything, especially their faces." He frowned slightly. "Why?" "Because sometimes," Amara said, voice steady, "the world needs proof of who the real fools are." As David nodded, slipping his phone from his pocket, Miranda finished her stretches and turned toward the DJ. "Let's start the music," she said with an exaggerated bow. The first soft notes of a waltz filled the air, elegant and haunting. The laughter dulled, all eyes fixed on the polished floor. Rick stepped back, his grin widening. "All right, everyone, the show's about to begin." But if he'd looked closer, really looked, he might have seen it. The faint shift in Amara's posture, the subtle lift of her chin, the stillness before a storm. The crowd believed they were watching a farce. Rick believed he was watching humiliation. Only David understood what was about to unfold. Because in that single, silent breath, before the music swelled, he recognized it, the poise of a dancer about to remind the world exactly who she was. The room was charged now, not with laughter, but with something heavier, sharper. As Amara stepped toward the center of the ballroom, the crowd instinctively shifted. forming a circle around her as if drawn by an unseen gravity. Her shoes tapped softly against the marble floor, each step measured, deliberate. She carried herself like someone walking into a storm, not to survive it, but to claim it. Rick Halden watched her with the smirk of a man who believed he'd already won. "All right, everyone," he announced, raising his glass high enough for the chandeliers to catch the reflection. "Let's make this interesting. $1,000 if she can make it through the whole song without falling. But if she stumbles, even once she cleans this entire floor on her knees." His words cut through the hum of whispers like broken glass. Laughter followed, though it was thinner now, uneasy. A few guests shifted, uncomfortable but unwilling to speak. "Dad, that's enough," Ethan said quietly, his voice tight. "You've made your point. Stop." But Rick didn't stop. He didn't even glance at his son. "Watch closely, Ethan," he said. "This is how the real world works. Some people dance, others clean up afterward." A low murmur passed through the room. Somewhere near the orchestra, a violinist looked away. Ethan's hands clenched at his sides. "You're humiliating yourself," he muttered, but the words were swallowed by the murmurs and the clinking of glasses. Amara didn't respond. She didn't even look at him. Instead, she closed her eyes. For a moment, everything went still. The music, the whispers, the air itself. And then, slowly, she inhaled. It wasn't just a breath. It was reclamation. The kind of breath a diver takes before plunging into the deep. The kind that remembers every note, every step, every ovation. Her chest rose, her shoulders settled, and when she opened her eyes, there was no trace of the maid they thought they knew. Only poise, only grace. Then she moved. At first, it was small, almost imperceptible. A tilt of her neck, a roll of her shoulder, a soft shift in her stance. But there was a precision to it, an awareness in every muscle that no amateur could fake. The way she aligned her spine, the weight on the balls of her feet, these were the movements of a trained dancer, not a servant. From the edge of the room, David Grant whispered, almost to himself, "She's really gonna do it." And she was. Her arms lifted in a quiet arc, fingers unfolding like petals at no dawn. The chandelier's light caught her skin, turning the air around her into gold. She stretched one leg behind, not in a showy flourish, but in the poised extension of someone who knew exactly how far her body could go. Her balance flawless, her control absolute. The crowd fell silent. The laughter died. The mockery evaporated. No one could quite explain it, but something about her presence unsettled them. There was power in her stillness, a dignity that didn't ask for permission. Rick's grin faltered. He tried to laugh again, but it came out thin, uncertain. Because even he, a man drunk on his own power, could feel it now. Something was shifting. Ethan's gaze softened as he watched her. The calm in her movements, the quiet strength in her breath, it didn't belong to a victim. It belonged to someone who had already conquered something far greater than ridicule. Amara rolled her shoulders once more, grounding herself. To the untrained eye, it looked simple, a stretch, a breath, a moment. But David saw it for what it was, ritual. The same ritual she'd done before every performance at the American Grand Ballet Theater. The prelude to flight. And in that instant, the atmosphere in the room changed. The light seemed a little warmer. The space felt smaller, closer. Those who had come to witness a joke now found themselves unable to look away. Because somewhere deep down, every one of them sensed what was about to happen, that the woman they tried to reduce to nothing was about to remind them what greatness looked like. Rick folded his arms, forcing a grin that no longer reached his eyes. "Whenever you're ready," he said mockingly, but his voice had lost its edge. Amara didn't answer. She didn't need to. She simply raised her head, exhaled once more, and waited for the first note of the waltz, the note that would decide not just the outcome of a bet, but the restoration of her name, her pride, and her light. Because people who have once touched brilliance, no matter how far they fall, always remember the way back. The first note rose like a thread of light through the hush, and the ballroom seemed to inhale with it. The waltz unfurled, elegant and familiar, the kind of melody that flatters the rich into believing they own grace. Miranda moved first. She stepped into the music with a polished smile and a carefully tilted chin. Heel-toe, heel-toe. The textbook sweep of someone who had bought every private lesson and memorized every flattering angle. Her gown rippled. Her arms traced the air with tidy geometry. It was clean, competent, photogenic, and utterly weightless. The crowd gave polite murmurs at each predictable turn. The way you nod at a painting you do not feel. A dancer in the orchestra pit glanced down, checking the time. Even the chandeliers looked bored. Miranda finished with a curtsy sharpened by years of practice in the mirror and a little laugh that said, "See? Effortless." Applause scattered, thin as confetti. Then the floor belonged to Amara. For a heartbeat, she didn't move. She listened. Not to the room, not to the whispers, but to the seam between notes where breath begins. And when she stepped, it was like the air softened to let her pass. Light as wind over water, strong as steel beneath silk. Her first glide skimmed the marble so quietly that the audience leaned in, as if afraid to miss the sound of a miracle arriving. A simple port de bras floated into the waltz's sway, and the melody changed shape around her, as though it had been waiting for her body to translate it correctly. The slow motion of awe took over. You could see it, row by row. The faces that had smirked moments ago now stilled, eyes widening as if waking from a long, shallow sleep. Amara's spine rose with the music's swell, her ribs lifted like a curtain drawing back on the memory of a stage. Her fingers opened, not to decorate the air, but to speak it. She turned into a balancé that melted into a half-turn, then traced a line with her legs so clean it seemed to draw an invisible signature across the floor. Rick's grin cracked. He was still, for once. The smirk fought to return to his lips and failed. Ethan lifted his phone higher, framing her against the cold glitter of the room, and realized the camera could not keep up with the truth. His hands steadied. He didn't want to miss a breath. Amara did not imitate a waltz. She rewrote it. Classical ballet phrasing braided through the three-beat pulse, every step an argument against gravity. A whispering pas de bourrée carried her through a diagonal like rain crossing glass. A pirouette bloomed, not flashy, not hungry for applause, just inevitable, a turn so centered it looked like the world was rotating around her. She advanced, retreated, suspended, letting the music climb into her chest and ring there like a bell. Somewhere in the second phrase, a woman near the back pressed a hand to her mouth. "I've seen that line," she whispered, "at American Grand." Her voice shook with the shock of recognition. It's her. On the mezzanine, a waiter paused with a tray balanced on his palm, watching with the open wonder of a child. Along the wall, a violinist forgot to pretend indifference and leaned forward, bow slack against strings, as if his body knew a cathedral had quietly been built in front of him. Amara's breath synced to the score, in on the rise, out on the fall, the kind of measured oxygen that only lives in people who have trained themselves to survive the impossible. She gathered the melody into a lifted arabesque, line long and luminous, and the room seemed to tilt toward her. The waltz wanted her to tilt with it, to tuck inside its easy prettiness. Instead, she answered with truth. A développé unfolded like a promise kept. A piqué turn sliced the air so cleanly that crystal chimed. Or maybe it only felt that way. She closed and opened, a heartbeat becoming choreography, and then came strength, quiet and ruthless. She crossed the floor in a series of traveling steps that would have punished any weak ankle, any uncertain core. Her body didn't ask permission from the past. It declared itself. Every muscle spoke. Scar tissue, too, spoke not as a flaw, but as a page rewritten in gold leaf. She leapt. Not the graceless flinging most would attempt, but a measured arc, a grand allegro tailored to the room, her feet catching the downbeat as if the beat itself had been waiting in her shoes. She landed without a sound. People exhaled as if they had been holding their breath for years. Rick's glass dipped. He swallowed hard and tasted something unfamiliar. Fear. Ethan felt the phone warming in his palm, the small device, now a witness, a sworn affidavit. He tracked her through a chain of turns that slipped into a promenade balanced on a thread of silence. He did not blink. He would not blink. The music gathered itself for the climb, and Amara answered with a phrase that belonged to her alone. A signature combination born before the accident and refined in the private hours after, when no one was watching. She stepped into a sequence of pirouettes that multiplied, a string of turning stars, then let them taper into a drift that caught like breath on glass. The waltz's lilting kindness became something braver in her hands, a river deepening, a vow tightening. Around the room, heads tilted, eyes shone. People who had come to laugh now stood straighter, as if conscience had tapped them on the spine. Their cruelty had not vanished. It had been outgrown in front of them. The truth was quieter than their mockery and infinitely heavier. Amara drew the final passage out of the air with pure control. A diagonal of piqué arabesques carried her toward center, then a turn, clean and closing, placed her exactly where the music wanted the last chord to land. She opened her arms, not in plea, not in performance, but in benediction, and lifted her chin to meet the chandelier's cold fire. That was the shape. That was the answer. Arms extended, head high. A body that had been told no, standing inside its own yes. Silence hit like a wave. For a long beat, no one moved. It was not confusion, it was reverence. And then, as if a fuse caught, sound rushed back in, one clap, then another, then all at once, a roar. Chairs scraped, people rose, the balcony thundered under their feet, and applause detonated against the marble until it sounded like rain. Dante's kind of rain, the cleansing kind. Rick did not clap. He could not. He was stone in a storm he had summoned and could no longer command. His face had drained of color, all that easy superiority washed out, leaving the slack jaw of a man who had mistaken money for power and discovered he owned neither in the only currency that matters. Ethan kept filming, tears pricking uninvited at the corners of his eyes, not out of pity, but out of awe. He lowered the phone only when Amara finally let the last note leave her shoulders and settle into the floor. Somewhere near the back, the woman who had recognized the signature line breathed the words aloud that everyone else had already felt. "I've seen that dance at AGBT," she said, voice breaking with certainty. "It's her." Amara did not bow. Not yet. She held the shape a heartbeat longer, letting the room understand what it had witnessed. Not a trick, not an exception, not a maid overreaching, but an artist reclaiming jurisdiction over her own name. The applause climbed higher, brighter, until it rattled glassware and loosened the grip arrogance had on the room. Only then did she lower her arms. Only then did she let a small, quiet smile touch her mouth, the kind of smile a lighthouse might wear when the storm finally understands who is in charge of the coast. The ovation swelled again, a standing wave, and in the center of it, Rick Halden stood very still, wrecked by the simple, devastating truth that a woman he had tried to break had just rewritten the rules on the very floor he thought he owned. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. The echoes of applause still hung in the air, trembling like the last note of a song that refused to die. Amara stood in the center of the marble floor, the light pooling around her like it knew exactly where it belonged. Her chest rose and fell with steady, disciplined breaths. Across the room, faces stared faces that only minutes ago had been twisted with mockery, now frozen in stunned reverence. And then, from the edge of the crowd, a deep voice broke the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," David Grant began, his tone firm, resonant, impossible to ignore. "Allow me to introduce the woman you've just witnessed." He stepped forward, lifting his phone slightly, his eyes locked on Rick Halden. That was no ordinary performance. You were watching Amara Leclerc, former principal dancer of the American Grand Ballet Theater, the woman who once brought audiences to tears across the world. The words struck like a thunderclap. Gasps rippled through the room. Some guests covered their mouths, others whispered in disbelief. Chairs scraped, heads turned. Miranda's hand flew to her chest. "No," she stammered, shaking her head. "That's impossible. Amara Leclerc is dead. Everyone knows she." But Amara turned toward her, calm as ever, her eyes steady and unflinching. A soft smile curved her lips. "Rumors of my death," she said evenly, "were a little exaggerated." A nervous chuckle flickered through the crowd, the kind that people use when they realize they've just witnessed something much bigger than themselves. Rick Halden didn't laugh. He couldn't. His skin had gone pale, his jaw locked tight. His eyes darted from Amara to the guests, searching for someone to rescue him from this reality. But no one moved. No one came. Amara stepped forward, her voice low but clear enough for every corner of the ballroom to hear. "Mr. Halden," she said, "you made a promise in front of 200 witnesses. You said that if I danced better than your wife, you'd keep your word." Rick straightened, forcing a brittle smile. "Come on now, let's not take everything so literally. It was a joke, a little fun." "A joke?" David cut in sharply, his tone carrying an edge of restrained fury. "Let's check that, shall we?" He raised his phone again, thumb hovering over the screen, "because I recorded every word." The crowd leaned in, drawn to the unfolding spectacle. The sound of Rick's own voice filled the air, confident, mocking, inescapable. "If she dances better than my wife, I'll marry my son to her on the spot. Play the waltz." The playback continued, the echo of cruel laughter filling the room once again. $1,000 if she lasts the song, but when she loses, she'll clean the floor on her knees. And then the recording captured the moment Amara accepted the challenge, the moment Rick doubled down. "Deal," he had said, his voice dripping arrogance. When the audio ended, silence reclaimed the room, heavier now, suffocating. Every eye turned to Rick. His smirk was gone. His composure shattered. Amara held his gaze. "You didn't make a joke," she said softly. "You made a wager, one you never thought you'd lose, and you made it loud enough for everyone here to hear." Her words were calm, measured, but each one landed like a verdict. "Now you'll keep your word, because where I come from, a person's promise still means something." Whispers broke out around them. "He really said that?" "He can't deny it. We all heard it." "Unbelievable." Rick took a step forward, his voice cracking under the weight of his own panic. "This is ridiculous. She's twisting my words. Everyone knows I was joking." "No," Amara interrupted, her tone cutting cleanly through his excuses. "What everyone knows, Mr. Halden, is that you thought you were untouchable. You believed your wealth gave you the right to decide who deserved respect. But tonight, in front of every witness here, you learned something important." She took one more step closer, the light catching the calm defiance in her eyes. "Dignity isn't something you can buy, and respect isn't something you can take." The murmurs grew louder now, shifting from confusion to outrage. A few guests who had laughed earlier looked down, ashamed. Ethan stood still, his face tight with a mix of pride and disbelief, his phone still recording. Rick's voice faltered. This isn't over." "It is," Amara replied, her words soft but final. "Because truth doesn't need your permission to exist." And as she turned away, the murmurs of the room followed her awe, guilt, and something else too. The unmistakable sound of a reputation crumbling in real time. The air in the ballroom felt charged, now like the moment before a lightning strike. Rick Halden stood rigid, face ashen, eyes darting wildly as if searching for an escape from the silence pressing in around him. But there was no escape. 200 witnesses, one recording, and the weight of his own arrogance now turned against him. Then, from the crowd, a single voice rose steady, clear, unmistakable. "Miss LeClaire." Ethan stepped forward, his phone still in his hand, his jaw tight but his eyes filled with something that looked like conviction. "I owe you an apology for not stopping this earlier, for being a coward when I should have spoken up." His gaze flicked to his father, then back to Amara. "What you did here tonight, it wasn't just a dance. It was truth, and I'm sorry for every second I stood by in silence." The room stirred. Someone murmured, "Good for him." Another whispered, "Finally." Rick's head snapped toward his. "Son, Ethan," he hissed, his voice breaking with fury. "Enough. You don't speak to her. You don't look at her. You don't." But Ethan didn't back down. His voice grew louder, steadier. "No, Dad. You don't get to tell me who to respect anymore." He took another step closer to Amara. "You wanted this to be a lesson? Fine. I've learned one that dignity means more than blood, and that some people are poor only in spirit." Rick's hands trembled. "You ungrateful. I'm done being part of your cruelty," Ethan said. "If standing with her means losing everything you've built, then so be it. I'd rather be broke with integrity than rich and hollow." The words struck like a hammer. A gasp rolled through the crowd. For the first time that night, it wasn't just Amara who stood against Rick, it was his own blood. Rick's voice wavered, cracking under the weight of disbelief. "You'd throw away everything? For her?" Ethan turned his head slowly. "Not for her," he said quietly. "For myself, for the man I want to be." Silence rippled outward. It wasn't just defiance, it was liberation. And everyone could feel it. Amara watched the exchange, her eyes soft but unwavering. When she finally spoke, her voice carried through the room like a calm wind cutting through chaos. "Mr. Halden," she said, "I didn't come here to destroy you. I didn't even come here to win." Her gaze swept the room over the stunned guests, the shaken host, and the son standing between them. "I came here to remind you, all of you, that a person's worth isn't measured by what they own or where they come from, but by what they carry in their heart." Rick said nothing. His mouth opened, then closed again. His power, the invisible leash he had always held over others, had snapped. Amara stepped closer, her tone turning firm but not cruel. "I don't need a marriage to prove my value. I don't need revenge to reclaim my dignity. I just need you to do what you promised, to admit you were wrong, and to learn, maybe for the first time, what it means to be human." A murmur rose from the crowd. Then, a single pair of hands began to clap. It was hesitant at first, then another joined, and another, until the entire hall erupted, applause crashing against the marble like waves breaking free. People who had laughed at her now stood tall, cheering, not because she had humiliated him, but because she had risen above him. Rick stood frozen, his face pale, his pride stripped bare. Every cheer was a mirror, showing him what he'd become, a man so blinded by privilege that he'd forgotten decency. He turned, muttering something under his breath about lawyers and contracts, but no one listened. No one cared. As he stormed toward the exit, the applause followed him not as a celebration, but as a verdict. The sound grew louder, echoing through the grand hall like justice itself. At the center of it all, Amara remained still, her chin lifted, her eyes bright. This was not a triumph born of vengeance. It was something rarer, the quiet victory of a soul that refused to bend. And in that moment, everyone watching understood. True nobility doesn't flow through bloodlines or bank accounts. It's written in character, in compassion, in the courage to rise and to forgive. By morning, the footage had already begun to spread, a minute-long clip that captured everything. The shattered glass, the cruel laughter, the impossible dance, and the silence that followed. Someone had titled it, "Millionaire Mocks Maid and Learns Who She Really Is." Within hours, it was everywhere. Across news sites, social media, talk shows, millions of people watched Amara LeClaire, the woman the world had once lost, rise again in front of 200 of Chicago's wealthiest and turn humiliation into history. By the end of the week, Rick Halden's name had become a cautionary tale. His face was splashed across headlines, but not for the empire he'd built, for the arrogance that destroyed it. Board members withdrew their support. Longtime investors pulled out. Within days, Halden Enterprises began to crumble under the weight of public outrage. Rick himself was forced to resign, escorted from his own building through a side entrance, his legacy reduced to a viral scandal and a trail of broken pride. Miranda disappeared from the public eye, retreating into quiet exile far from the city that once bowed to her. And perhaps for the first time in her life, silence was all she had left. But from the ashes of arrogance, something better began to grow. Ethan Halden, no longer his father's shadow, stepped into leadership with a promise. The company would no longer serve profit above people. Under his direction, Halden Industries transformed, redirecting its resources into funding local education, housing projects, and arts programs across underserved communities. The same company that once mocked a cleaner now built studios where artists could rise without fear of judgment. And Amara, the woman who had once vanished from the stage, found herself at the heart of it all. Calls flooded in from theaters, universities, and international ballet companies. They wanted her to choreograph, to teach, to tell her story. But she chose something else, something deeper. 6 months later, in the heart of Chicago, a new building opened its doors, the Amara LeClaire Center for the Arts, a sanctuary for dreamers, a home for every child who had been told they didn't belong on the stage. The opening night drew crowds from every walk of life, dancers, teachers, children in secondhand shoes, and strangers who had seen her video and found courage in her grace. David Grant stood beside her as the curtains lifted on the first student performance. His voice carried the pride of every unseen worker who had ever been told they were invisible. "You didn't just win, Amara," he said softly. "You lifted all of us." On the stage before them, a dozen children began their first dance, awkward, earnest, beautiful. Some stumbled, some twirled too quickly. But their faces shone with something pure, belief. And in the reflection of their joy, Amara saw herself not the broken ballerina, not the humiliated maid, but the woman who had finally learned that art wasn't about perfection, it was about becoming whole again. A tear slipped down her cheek, quiet and unashamed. She turned to find Ethan at her side, holding a bouquet of wildflowers, nothing extravagant, just honest. "Dinner?" he asked, smiling. Amara looked at the stage again, at the children, leaping toward the light and then back at him. For the first time in years, her smile carried no sadness. "Yes," she said softly, "I think I'm finally ready to live again." The crowd rose to their feet in applause, echoing through the new hall like a heartbeat. Somewhere in the noise, a voice called her name, not the one she hid behind, but the one she had reclaimed, Amara LeClaire. And this time, it wasn't whispered in pity or awe. It was spoken with love, because her story had become more than a comeback. It was a reminder that no amount of power can silence dignity, and no amount of cruelty can bury truth. And now, as the lights fade and the music lingers, we want to ask you, have you ever been underestimated? Have you ever been judged before someone even knew your story? If this tale touched you, leave a comment below. Tell us your moment. Because when we share how we rise, we remind the world that no one gets to decide our worth. If you believe in stories that celebrate resilience, redemption, and the power of grace, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because sometimes, the most extraordinary revenge is simply to shine. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, spilling across the polished studio floor like liquid gold. The air was filled with soft laughter, the shuffle of little feet learning their first steps, and the faint echo of music, the kind that reminds you life can begin again, even after it breaks. Amara stood at the center of the room, watching her students move, some clumsy, some graceful, all fearless. Their eyes carried the same spark she once had, before the world tried to dim it. She smiled, her hands folded gently in front of her as the light traced her silhouette. For the first time in years, there was no pain in her gaze, only peace. Because she knew now the stage she was meant to stand on was never just under the spotlight. It was here, among those who needed her strength, her story, her second chance. And then, softly, the narrator's voice came calm, steady, and full of truth. Sometimes, we have to lose everything to discover who we truly are. And sometimes, others must lose everything to finally see they were never who they thought they were. A quiet stillness settled over the room. Amara turned as footsteps approached. Ethan stood there, holding a bouquet of fresh wildflowers, simple, sincere. He smiled. Ready for dinner? She looked at him, at the light behind him, and at the life she had rebuilt piece by piece. And then she reached out, taking his hand. Her smile gentle, certain said more than words ever could. It was not a victory born from vengeance, but from release. And as the narrator's voice returned, it carried a warmth that wrapped around the listener like a promise. Amara's triumph was never about defeating her enemies. It was about transforming pain into light. She proved that when we respond to cruelty with brilliance, when we meet hate with grace, we don't just win, we redefine what victory means. Because true power doesn't come from wealth or status. It comes from the courage to rise and the kindness to forgive. Outside the windows, the sun dipped lower, painting the walls in gold and amber. The children spun and laughed, their shadows dancing across the floor, a living reminder that beauty can bloom from brokenness. And then, as the music faded, came one last invitation, soft, personal, and full of heart. What about you? Have you ever been underestimated, judged before anyone knew your worth? Tell us your story in the comments below, because every voice matters, and your truth might be the light someone else needs. A pause. Then, the final words, a whisper that carried strength. And if this story touched you, hit like, subscribe, and stay with us, because here, we tell stories that remind you, justice always finds its way.